creative facilitation is about bringing a potentially very diverse group of people together and using methods that are, arts-based and experimental sometimes, means that you can form meaningful connections along the way.
Hello there, I'm Sarah McCluskey and this is Research Adjacent. Each episode I talk to amazing research adjacent professionals about what they do and why it makes a difference. Keep listening to find out why we think the research adjacent space is where the real magic happens. In this week's episode I'm talking to a former colleague and dear friend from my days at Durham University. Mary Robson is, we think, the UK's only full-time university-based creative facilitator. She works at the Institute for Medical Humanities at Durham University, where she has become synonymous with sticky walls, hexagons of unexpectedness and pipe cleaners, all tools that she uses to get people thinking and talking. As we discuss, where her approach really shines is in creating spaces where diverse groups of people can come together to work on a shared problem. In academia, this has been particularly effective for facilitating interdisciplinary research and also in being genuinely inclusive of voices from outside the academy. As someone who's experienced many of Mary's creatively facilitated workshops, I can vouch for the fact that whilst her approach might be hard to articulate at times, it's certainly effective. Listen on to find out more. Welcome along to the podcast, Mary. Lovely to have you here with us. I wonder if we could just start by asking you to tell us a bit about what it is that you do and how you got into that sort of work.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for asking me. Lovely to be here. I am a creative facilitator. I work at the Institute for Medical Humanities at Durham University. Lots of people may now be asking, I wonder what that is. Because it's a relative, we think it's a unique role. I'm not saying that there is no one else doing any kind of creative facilitation in the academy, but mine is a dedicated role. I'm full-time. But I've come to this place via a kind of circuitous route on one level, but then with a very clear line through everything I've ever done, I think, as a professional, which is that I fundamentally make things with people. So I began life as a theatre designer. I went to art school. I did a lot of work in new writing theatre, as well as with some very radical theatre groups like Welfare State International, building site-specific work in places that would least expect it. And then I ended up at the confluence really of arts and health, and then with education too. So I used to run a lot of longitudinal projects based in a primary school, but working by, with and for that community around the social and emotional development of its children. And then kind of found myself invited in to the academy, partly in a way to bring some of that real world project work in. At Durham, they were very interested then in arts and health. And I was working with communities doing kind of health audits through lantern processions, amongst other things. And gradually found myself, sometimes I have to admit, sitting on my facilitatory hands in meetings and ending up facilitating some processes with my colleagues in a very kind of friendly and amenable way, that eventually led to a role on a big interdisciplinary project called Hearing the Voice. So that's about 10 years ago now. So I was written into that project, which was a longitudinal study again, eventually, into the phenomenon of hearing a voice when there's no one there, or there's no physical stimulus present. And my job there initially was to build the community of the researchers. So again, something that's not usually, and certainly not within the academy, paid that much attention to, in terms of it's all very well to talk about the what and the who, but how do you do that? And so that we've gradually built not only a practice around that, I think, but also upped the ante on research culture. I think it's been fundamental in terms of then the academic, or the intellectual, I should say, development of that project and subsequent ones. And also it's been a way of injecting communitas importantly into them. It's also ended up by, as patterned with Hearing the Voice, of being as inclusive as was possible with at every level with people who hear voices. And that sounds very straightforward when you say it in retrospect, but of course that was a continuous learning process on everyone's behalf, I think. And it's that openness and reflexivity that I think has led us to be much more ethically aware than we would have been otherwise.
Yeah, I think that, as you said there, this idea of using your approach to build community, both within the researchers and also with the communities that you wanted to work with on this research, is something that a lot of people will be really interested in. How does, what does creative facilitation bring to that? How does creative facilitation help to build that community?
I suppose, broadly speaking, you could say creative facilitation is about bringing a potentially very diverse group of people together and using methods that are, you know, arts-based and experimental sometimes, means that you can form meaningful connections along the way. So, for example, using something that is about finding consensus in a group, i.e. not the very opposite of groupthink, about allowing for all those different voices and different opinions to be held. The process of doing that, which involves, and this is a kind of form that we use, I think, quite a lot here, which is you start off on your own thinking about what your experience has taught you about whatever that topic is. You then take that to a very small group, confident that you have something to talk about. And then you are part of a much bigger group deciding which bit of information goes where. That process leads to relationship building. It's kind of person-centered in a way. So I think it's the combination of those kind of methods. I don't think there's any kind of one size fits all. I think they're also tailor-made as to whether it's a internally facing research group or whether it's a workshop with voice hearers where you're really looking to get their deeply held opinions and perspectives on something that you're trying to produce, or whether it's an arts workshop, again, that is looking to produce work that will be part of an exhibition about it. All of those things are about people being heard.
Yeah,
that makes enough sense. Yeah.
I think so. And do you think that having your arts background gives you a different perspective when you come into the sorts of research spaces that you now work in?
I think so. I think more and more, actually. I think the theatre background is interesting because I was a designer. I'm also very interested in space, as well as how it's populated. So sometimes the dynamics of how something is going to happen are somewhat dependent on the space you have too.
Yeah.
And so I think all of those things together help. I also think, I mean, I'm relatively long in the tooth now, so I've had a lot of experience of very different arts-based techniques. So I think there is a certain confidence about knowing or instinct about knowing what will work. And sometimes quite small things can make a really big difference to how people feel. So an example might be, there's one technique called open space, which in many ways I like, but if you do it by the book, it insists that everybody sits in a big circle and then comes into the middle of the circle, bends down to the floor, gets a bit of paper to write something on, their deeply held comment or whatever it's going to be, and show it to everybody. And I actually think that's really exposing to almost everyone. And that's about, on the one hand, people saying, oh, the circle is a marvelous thing and it's so equalizing, but not if it's big, and not if you ask people to walk into the middle of it, and it doesn't account for people who are introverted, for example.
Yeah, that feeling of everyone looking at you.
Very self-conscious. So, you know, being able to have the chutzpah sometimes to go, no, I don't think we'll be doing it like that. To take the tenets of something, but really not do it by the book, I think is one of the benefits, I think, of my background. Yeah.
It's certainly, having experienced a Mary Robson facilitated meeting, it's very different to most other academic type meetings I've been in. So yeah,
this is a good thing. Yeah.
And can I just ask maybe some examples, whether it's from your current role or from other things that you've done over the years, some things that you're really proud of?
Yes, I think I'm always hesitant about these. It's a bit like, what is your favorite something? I'm always a bit hesitant about it, because I'm always afraid of downgrading something that I would have been proud of at the time. So I think because I'm quite in the moment, I'm actually very proud of what I did last week.
Yeah.
Which was, there was a 2-day workshop with my colleague, Professor Alex Broadbent, who is a philosopher of epidemiology. And he brought together a group of scholars and others from South Africa, Sudan, Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, Congo, I think I've got them all, in person, along with academics here at Durham, for a workshop that is leading towards hopefully a grant application, but was around knowledge, disease and power in Africa, not seeing Africa as a kind of monolithic place, but rather as a whole bundle of differences as well. And so I think everybody came in feeling really skeptical or concerned about how is this going to happen, because these people were coming from very different backgrounds. They weren't all academics, actually. There were people who deal more with public health, or are looking at, even as academics, are looking at things like mass trauma and global health. So very, very different perspectives. And there was lots of concerns expressed only, I'm glad to say, in retrospect, where they were thinking, how is this going to work? And basically, in a day and a half, we ended up producing the skeleton of the framework of a potential application with consensus around it, and deciding what we really didn't want it to be. And it was a very, the first day was it was a kind of consensus workshop, as I briefly described before, but it was possibly one of the longest I've ever done, because there was so much thinking going on in the room. But in the end, we had a wall full of cards that answered that very basic question about how these people were going to come together in order to do this. And then we're able to flesh that out with research questions and ideas about what people did not want to do very clearly by the end. And there was a great sense of, again, of people, of people feeling bonded to it, not friends for life or anything like that. I don't want to over-egg this, but certainly we were all looking back and going, my goodness, have we done that in this amount of time? And there was a great atmosphere. And so I'm inordinately proud of that, because it was a process that, whilst we had a very strong framework in there, we had to be nimble and reflexive and change things as we went along. And I don't think you can do that unless you've got a good solid framework to start with. And then lastly, I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Again, that's always, the everyday school day is always something for me. I think to be able to reflect on something and go, do you know what? We did that at the end. That means you could actually set that up. You could, when you looked at it in retrospect, you could almost have a framework that would enable you to get from A to C in a way that hasn't quite been done before. Always bearing in mind, of course, Sarah, that it all depends on who's in the room as well. So that's always a key factor. But yeah, I'm very proud of that.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Sounds brilliant. Look forward to seeing if what comes out of it. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. You've touched a little bit on some of the challenges that you've faced along the way. What do you think are, in the work you're doing now, or even just getting into the work that you're doing now, have been the biggest stumbling blocks?
Yeah, I think some of the challenges can be relatively quickly dispelled, but it's the fact that they have to be dispelled every time. So one of them is the kind of people not signing up for it in certain situations, or not thinking it would make a difference, or maybe being a bit dismissive. But I can't say that I've had too much of that. I'm very fortunate in that I work with colleagues who are incredibly supportive and who, in fact, have helped to develop the work along the way. Couldn't happen. If it was just me, it couldn't happen, I don't think. I think we recently published a report about the work that I do. Other people did the interrogation of what it is that I do. And some of the challenges there were interesting, I think, around that it takes time. It's not a quick fix, and it needs a lot of planning. And so that sometimes can be very challenging. It's whilst I make every effort for it to be as smooth as possible, it can be a challenge for participants, dependent on what the workshop is.
Yeah.
About putting people through their paces. And I think sometimes it's seen as a bit of magic dust.
Yeah.
That you can just, it's all right, we'll just get Mary in to do that and everything will be fine. But actually, it's not always the right thing.
Yeah.
You have to think very carefully about when and why you use it and with whom. And also, as you can probably tell by my hesitancy, it's actually very difficult to articulate the benefits of it. And so to get that across to people who haven't experienced it is tricky. And also that if it's simply perceived as a Mary Robson shaped space, that in itself is problematic, because I can't be in all of the places all of the time. Hence, one is now looking at training, which is great for the people. Yeah.
And do you think it is something that people could be trained to do?
Well, I think one of the issues with it is people perceive it as the singer and not the song. And I don't think it's just the song and not the singer. But I think people have very different styles and different ways of doing it. So this last summer, we piloted a 2-day course with an optional third day. So the first 2 days we're looking at the fundamentals of creative facilitation, and then the optional third day is about presence and practice, because what we discovered, and quite rightly, is some people will come on that training not to be a creative facilitator, but to determine when or why they might want to use creative facilitation.
Right, okay.
And so it's very useful to have that mix of people in the room. And therefore, the third day is optional because it's about presence and practice. Because one of the things I think that comes across very clearly is people are very fearful of doing it. It's very demanding. But if you put people into co-facilitator roles, and if they're working in twos, for example, that's a lot. You're building in safety. You're building in inbuilt reflection. You're building in ways of doing it that are really helpful. It doesn't necessarily mean that it would be twice the cost. I think within the academy, especially when you're working within projects, you might be just talking about running meetings differently.
Yeah.
You know, and with no disrespect to anybody, you know, I think there are certain boards of studies that could be shorter and more enjoyable, possibly, from what I hear. But, you know, so it may be, again, it's not just about being a facilitator. It's also about, I could do this, or I might change as a researcher. I might change the way I run so-called focus groups as a result of this, for example. So I think there are benefits to it across the board.
Yeah, not just people who are aspiring to follow in your footsteps.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
Although a few of those will be really good. Yeah.
Well, that kind of leads us very nicely on to my next question, which is, if you had a magic wand and an unlimited budget, what would you do?
Oh, it's another one of those questions, Sarah. It's so tricky. But I think when I've been asked this before about the academy, one of the things I've always wanted to change within the academy is the balance between teaching and research. Because I think there are whole sets of skills and experiences there that are missed and that are treated as second rate. So if you're a brilliant teacher, you haven't got the publications and therefore somehow aren't regarded in the same light, which I just think is fundamentally wrong. But that leads me onto a number of other areas. And I was just discussing some of this with my colleagues earlier today. One of them is the way that the people who are participants in research projects or voluntary sector, third sector organizations who help by having the space and the time to partner with research projects, the ways in which they are not recompensed and i.e. to me not valued, whether as individuals. So now we can't even give people vouchers if they're on benefits, because that is still counted by government as being income, and therefore people would lose money from their benefits. Or whether they're an organization that puts an awful lot of work into finding the people who you'd want to work with, and whose core business is to help those people, but the time they could have been spending helping those people is being used on a research project for very laudable reasons, but there is no help or recompense for that organization. I think that's fundamentally wrong and needs some really concerted systemic action. I know there are arguments around it being coercive to pay people for what it is they do, especially if they're an organization. But as one of my colleagues said this morning, it's not coercive to pay the researchers to do the research.
Indeed.
So, you know, there's a mismatch there. So there are lots of, so if I had a magic wand, I think I'd like to deal with that latter one.
Yeah.
I think it's fundamental.
A lot of people would be in there with you, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah.
I would just like now to give you the opportunity, if there are some other people who you think are doing some great work around the kind of field that you inhabit, if you'd like to tell us about them.
Yes, there aren't many of us doing creative facilitation in the academy, but I do have one person who I have worked with and meet with regularly. I have a Friday facilitators group that meets informally, and the marvellously named Bentley Crudgington, formerly at Manchester, but now doing a whole heap of other things, I think does exceptional work. His job in the academy originally was based on mine, panned out very, very differently. Very different set of circumstances, different people, different kinds of projects, and so does work sometimes less in the humanities than I do, but also has fantastic skills around radically different engagement work. I think their work is really brilliant. But also I have colleagues who don't necessarily operate from within the academy. And one that comes to mind is in Delhi, Pradeep Narayanan, and works in an outfit called Praxis, kind of participatory research. And from very kind of Marxist principles, again, does exceptional work, kind of managing to bring together the social and the cultural and the political, whilst being extremely rigorous about what it is they do. So working in very difficult situations with very, areas of huge deprivation, and yet still helping people to become community researchers and contribute to making a difference. So really different work and culturally very different, but a lot to learn from.
Yeah, sounds fantastic. We'll have to see if we can get some links for their work and put them in the show notes. Yes, people can follow up if they're interested. Yeah. It just remains, Mary, to say thank you very much for having a chat with us. If people want to know more about you and your work, whereabouts can they find you?
Well, if they go to the Institute for Medical Humanities website, we now have a section under research called the Creative Facilitation Unit. And so in there, you'll find that the report I've mentioned, which I hope people find interesting to read, and also links to any future training programs we've got. And as we go on over the next year or two, I'm entirely hopeful that it will be populated with even more gems. So please keep an eye on us there.
Excellent. We'll get the link and I'll also put that in the show notes.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's been lovely chatting with you and such an interesting conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Research Adjacent. You can find show notes and other episodes at researchadjacent.com. I would absolutely love to hear what you think of the show, so please get in touch. You can drop us a message via researchadjacent.com or find us on social media at resadjacent. And if you've enjoyed the show, please think about sharing it, subscribing or leaving a review so that other people can find us too. Research Adjacent is presented and produced by Sarah McCluskey, and you, yes you, get a big gold star for listening right to the end. See you next time.